Welcome to The Explainer. I'm so glad you're joining us today. We're jumping right into the political landscape of Africa. And to really wrap our heads around it, you kind of have to think of it like a building constructed on a totally faulty blueprint. When a skyscraper is swaying dangerously in the wind, you don't just stare at the windows, right? You inspect the foundation. And today, we're going to inspect those foundational structures laid down during the colonial era to figure out exactly why they created such lasting instability.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Why is political instability such a recurring feature across the continent? Well, it's pretty easy to just look at the symptoms, the crises, the conflicts, the sudden changes in government, and assume that's the whole story. But we need to think way beyond the symptoms here. We're going to look for the mechanical root causes, those actual structural flaws that were embedded deeply into the system by colonial powers.
To do that, we're going to treat this explainer as basically an impartial inspection report. We'll quickly walk through the roots of instability, the redrawing of the map, the engineering of economic dependence, the military structures in divide, rule, and arm, and finally, the neo-colonial trap.
All right, starting off with Section 1, the roots of instability.
To understand this faulty foundation, we have to look completely past that old deceptive narrative of a civilizing mission. The unvarnished reality? It was entirely about economic exploitation. Kwame Nkrumah actually summarized this perfectly as an egotistical imposition of the strong upon the weak. Back in 1885, Jules Ferry explicitly stated their objectives: get access to raw materials, provide new markets, and invest surplus capital. That's it. It was pure extraction. These structures absolutely weren't built for stability, they were built to take.
What's really interesting about this is how Nkrumah perfectly distilled this imperialism into three distinct mechanical doctrines: exploitation, trusteeship, and assimilation. These weren't just accidents or side effects. They were deliberate systems, designed from the ground up to systematically bind the colonies directly to the mother country.
Moving on to Section 2, redrawing the map. If a building is built on a geographic fault line, it's going to collapse, right? Well, here, the fault lines were drawn by hand. It's truly staggering how incredibly fast this balkanization happened. Check this out. In 1881, France goes into Tunisia. Just 4 short years later, by 1885, the partition of Africa at the Berlin Conference is totally concluded. An entire continent turned into a geopolitical chessboard in a matter of months, prioritizing European diplomacy and greed over actual local realities. And this brilliantly illustrates the massive clash of systems that followed. On one hand, pre-colonial life was often based on customary, unwritten constitutions and a consensus-based equilibrium. But on the other hand, these new colonial systems, they were authoritarian, completely alien, and strictly top-down. Superimposing this rigid structure severely disrupted any kind of local political balance that existed. The Berlin Conference basically resulted in entirely arbitrary boundaries. Diverse, sometimes conflicting groups were just welded together under one administration, while homogeneous groups were completely split apart. These artificial lines laid the absolute groundwork for the national question, fostering this intense, zero-sum ethnic competition that still shakes the foundations of these states today. Next up, Section 3, engineering economic dependence. Because ultimately, political borders and authoritarian administrations were really just tools for economic extraction, and you absolutely cannot build stability on economic fragility. The colonial blueprint established what's called a dual economy. So you have a village subsistence economy merely surviving, coexisting right alongside a modern economy. But that modern economy isn't designed to uplift the village at all. It's built entirely to feed international commerce. The local population was effectively disconnected from the wealth of their own land. So the crucial point here is perfectly captured by the African economic paradox: not producing what they consume and not consuming what they produce. Forcing this monocultural cash crop focus completely destroyed pre-colonial self-reliance. It left the economy permanently vulnerable to international market fluctuations. And it went even further than just agricultural cash crops. Colonies were legally mandated to be non-manufacturing dependencies. Literally, colonial subjects were systematically prohibited from acquiring modern industrial techniques. They were locked in as simple producers of raw materials using cheap labor. This intentionally stunted economic development, locking the foundation in a perpetual state of weakness.
Let's move into Section 4, divide, rule, and arm. Let's see how this builds, because every state relies on institutions to maintain order. But what happens when the military is specifically engineered to divide the state? The colonial recruitment strategy was a literal masterclass in divide and rule. They actively sought out uneducated or minority groups for brawn, intentionally excluded educated elites who actually had the brains to rebel, and completely debarred traditionally powerful warrior groups like the Ashanti. This forensically dismantled national unity.
The military heritage left behind was commandist, paternalistic, and inherently ill-suited for civil society. But here's the really tragic irony of it all. Because the military was often the only institution sufficiently organized and equipped by the colonizers, it inevitably stepped in as a strategically placed arbiter during post-colonial political crises. A divided, authoritarian military essentially became the default stabilizing force in an inherently unstable system.
Which brings us to Section 5, the neo-colonial trap.
So what actually happens when the architects of these faulty structures officially leave the building? Did independence fix the foundation? I mean, the euphoria of anti-colonial nationalism was immense, for sure, but inheriting a flawed blueprint is very, very different from getting to draft a new one.
And this created the reality of neo-colonialism. These states achieved nominal independence and outward sovereignty. They were flying their own flags. But internally, the leaders who inherited power often just retained those artificial colonial frontiers and overdeveloped bureaucracies. The economic and political systems remained highly vulnerable to external manipulation. It was flag independence without true structural independence.
Which brings us to a highly profound observation by Claude Ake. He said, "African leaders are in office and not in power." This striking quote really encapsulates the ultimate tragedy of the post-colonial state. The inheritors of these new nations were basically handed the keys to a building that was fundamentally designed to collapse, or at the very least, to remain totally dependent on the original architects.
So we arrive at the ultimate challenge. How can these nations finally rip up those old exploitative colonial blueprints and design a stable future for themselves? True stability requires completely dismantling this inherited syndrome. We're talking moving past artificial borders, dual economies, and divided institutions. Understanding the cracks in the foundation is just the very first step to rebuilding it. But the real question remains, who will get to draw the new blueprint?